In the spring of 1829, the plantation known as Hawthorne Ridge appeared no different from dozens of others scattered across the low country of the American South. From the road, its fields stretched outward in neat, deliberate lines. The main house stood elevated, whitewashed and symmetrical, its columns facing the land as if overseeing it by design. To visitors, Hawthorne Ridge represented order, economic, social, and moral, at least by the standards of its time. But like most places built on forced labor, the appearance of stability masked a deeper fragility. Records from the county ledger describe Hawthorne Ridge as productive and well-managed, owned by a man named Thomas Whitaker, whose holdings included land, livestock, and 73 enslaved individuals. Among those listed was a man named Nathaniel Reed, aged approximately 28, assigned primarily to carpentry and repair. There was nothing in the official documentation to suggest that Nathaniel's name would ever be remembered beyond the inventory line where it appeared. What the records could not capture was what existed beneath the plantation's soil. Nathaniel Reed had been born into bondage, though the exact location of his birth remains unclear. Oral histories collected decades later suggest he was raised on a smaller property several miles east, where his early exposure to woodworking and tools distinguished him from other children. By the time he was sold to Whitaker in the early 1820s, Nathaniel had already developed a reputation as someone who could fix what others could not. Broken gates, warped doors, foundations weakened by rain. He worked quietly, efficiently, and without complaint, traits that earned him relative freedom of movement across the plantation. It was that movement, unrestricted compared to most, that would later matter. Hawthorne Ridge sat on uneven ground, a mix of packed clay and softer earth near the tree line. Seasonal flooding was a constant problem. Cellars collapsed. Root systems disrupted fence posts. More than once, Whitaker ordered trenches dug to redirect water away from the main house and storage buildings. Nathaniel was frequently assigned to supervise or assist with these tasks. He learned the land by feel, where it resisted the shovel, where it gave way too easily, where the ground held air pockets and where it compressed under weight. This knowledge was never written down. It lived only in memory. At some point, historians cannot agree precisely when the idea formed. There is no evidence of a single moment of decision, no dramatic turning point. What seems more likely is that the tunnel began not as a grand plan, but as a practical response to a small problem. A place to store tools out of sight. A shallow recess dug beneath an abandoned shed near the edge of the quarters. A space that could not be searched casually because no one believed it existed. The earliest portion of the tunnel was modest, no more than a narrow crawlspace reinforced with salvaged wood. Nathaniel worked on it alone, always at night, always in short intervals. He carried soil away in sacks, dispersing it gradually into the fields where disturbances would not be noticed. He reinforced weak points with scrap lumber taken from repair jobs. Everything about the work was designed to avoid attention. Silence was the most important tool he had. On a plantation governed by surveillance, invisibility was not achieved by hiding completely, but by appearing unremarkable. Nathaniel did not run. He did not resist openly. He fulfilled his duties with care, even diligence. When asked questions, he answered plainly. When punished, rarely according to available accounts, he accepted it without protest. This behavior, often misinterpreted by overseers as submission, allowed him to continue working without suspicion. Over time the tunnel grew. It extended first toward the tree line, then inward, passing beneath storage sheds and eventually running parallel to the main field paths. The tunnel was never large enough to stand in. It did not resemble the escape passages romanticized in later stories. It was narrow, rough, and physically demanding to navigate. Its purpose was not flight. It was access. From below, Nathaniel could hear footsteps overhead. He learned the rhythms of the plantation from sound alone, the difference between work boots and polished shoes, between hurried movement and leisurely pacing. He learned which paths were used at dawn and which were avoided after dark. He learned how voices carried through soil, how certain words repeated often, and how others were spoken only in private. Information gathered this way became a kind of currency. There is no evidence that Nathaniel shared this knowledge widely in the early years. On the contrary, testimonies collected later suggest he was cautious, selective, and deliberate. Trust, once broken, could not be repaired. The tunnel was not a communal project, it was a solitary one. Others may have suspected something, noticed his absences, the dirt under his nails, but suspicion without proof rarely survived the rigid hierarchies of plantation life. To question the system required certainty. Certainty was dangerous. What makes Nathaniel Reed's actions remarkable is not the physical feat of digging a tunnel beneath a working plantation, but the patience required to maintain it. For years the tunnel existed without incident. No escape attempt was made through it. No confrontation occurred. The plantation continued operating as before, unaware that beneath its routines lay a structure built entirely outside its control. This is where the story often tempts exaggeration, but the historical reality is quieter. Nathaniel did not undermine Hawthorne Ridge through sabotage or violence. He did not collapse buildings or orchestrate revolt. Instead, he created a space where the rules of visibility no longer applied. A place where observation could occur without being observed. In a system dependent on constant monitoring, that alone represented a profound shift. By the late 1820s, subtle changes began to occur. Tools went missing and reappeared. Messages were delivered without explanation. Certain individuals avoided punishment they might otherwise have received, while others were reassigned unexpectedly. Overseers attributed these irregularities to coincidence, incompetence, or poor record-keeping. They did not consider the possibility that the plantation was being quietly studied from below. Nathaniel Reed remained, in every official sense, an enslaved man performing his assigned labor. His name appeared unchanged in the ledger. His value was calculated in dollars and depreciated annually. Above ground, nothing suggested that Hawthorne Ridge was anything other than what it had always been. Below ground, however, a structure built in secrecy had begun to shape events, slowly, invisibly, and without asking permission. And while no one yet understood the consequences of that hidden work, the tunnel had already passed a point of no return. Because once something unseen begins influencing outcomes, the system that depends on certainty can no longer fully trust what it sees. Consequences beneath the ground. By the early 1830s, Hawthorne Ridge was no longer operating on certainty alone. The plantation still followed its routines. Bells rang, work began, orders were given and carried out, but something subtle had shifted. The change was not dramatic enough to provoke alarm. It registered instead as a pattern of small irregularities, each insignificant on its own, but collectively difficult to explain. The tunnel had begun to act. Not in the way its maker may have intended, and not entirely under his control. Nathaniel Reed never described the tunnel as a plan for influence. If anything, the available accounts suggest he viewed it as a precaution, a structure that might be needed one day, not a mechanism meant to shape events. But systems built in secrecy rarely remain neutral. Once they exist, they interact with the world above them in ways their creators cannot fully predict. The first consequences were practical. Nathaniel's ability to move unseen allowed him to be present where he was not expected. Repairs that should have taken days were completed overnight. Structural weaknesses were identified before they became visible. In several instances, buildings were reinforced just days before storms that would have otherwise caused significant damage. Whitaker credited these outcomes to good fortune and skilled labor. Nathaniel was praised quietly, rewarded with additional responsibilities, and given even greater access to the plantation's infrastructure. Each reward deepened the imbalance. The tunnel also altered Nathaniel's relationship to time. While others experienced the plantation in rigid segments, work hours, rest hours, surveillance hours, Nathaniel moved through overlapping rhythms. He learned which hours were truly monitored and which merely assumed to be. He learned how long it took for a command to travel from the main house to the far fields, how delays formed, and where authority thinned as distance increased. This knowledge did not remain theoretical. At some point, others began to notice that Nathaniel seemed to know things before they happened. A punishment avoided. A reassignment anticipated. A delivery prepared for ahead of schedule. Those closest to him could not explain how he knew, only that he often did. The tunnel, still undiscovered, had become an unspoken source of foresight. And foresight, even when unacknowledged, changes behavior. People began to listen to Nathaniel differently. Not openly. Not with trust that could be named. But with attention. When he suggested caution, it was taken seriously. When he advised silence, it was respected. The tunnel had not created authority, but it had created credibility, and that was enough to begin reshaping outcomes. The plantation's overseers noticed none of this directly. What they noticed instead was confusion. Orders were followed, but not always in the intended sequence. Tasks were completed efficiently, but sometimes in ways that deviated slightly from instruction. When questioned, workers offered explanations that were technically accurate but incomplete. Nothing rose to the level of defiance. Nothing justified punishment. Yet the sense of total control, the illusion that nothing occurred without oversight, began to erode. The tunnel made observation one-sided. Nathaniel heard conversations meant to be private. Discussions about debt. About land sales. About Whitaker's increasing dependence on credit. He learned which buildings were insured and which were not, which fields were considered expendable, which workers were valued and which were viewed as replaceable. This information did not lead to dramatic action, but it influenced quiet decisions. Where effort was concentrated, where it was withheld. Gradually, the plantation's efficiency began to shift away from its stated priorities. Fields deemed unimportant produced better yields than expected. Repairs appeared where budgets suggested they should not. Certain losses were mitigated before they were noticed. Whitaker, puzzled but pleased, assumed the plantation was simply running better than it ever had. He did not realize that the improvement was not centralized. What Nathaniel could not control, however, was the spread of assumption. Others began to believe that the plantation was changing, not because of any one individual but because something had shifted. Some attributed it to Whitaker's management. Others to luck. A few whispered explanations they could not fully articulate. The tunnel had begun shaping perception. This was where consequences became complicated. Nathaniel had never intended the tunnel to be known, but secrecy has limits. Soil patterns changed. Wood disappeared in small quantities too consistently to be coincidence. Night sounds were occasionally heard near the tree line. Overseers dismissed these signs individually, but together they formed a background unease. More troubling was the way authority began encountering resistance it could not locate. Punishments lost their predictability. Fear, once a reliable tool, became inconsistent. People endured it, but they did not always respond as expected. Some complied immediately. Others complied strategically. A few complied outwardly while adjusting their behavior in ways that avoided future exposure altogether. The plantation still functioned, but not in alignment with its own logic. Nathaniel felt this shift more acutely than anyone. What began as a structure he controlled was now influencing events beyond his intention. People acted on information he had never given them. Decisions were made based on assumptions about safety or risk that he had not confirmed. The tunnel had created a space where knowledge circulated indirectly, altering outcomes without direct communication. This loss of control troubled him. There are no records of Nathaniel expressing regret, but later testimonies suggest a growing awareness that secrecy, once shared even implicitly, takes on a life of its own. The tunnel no longer belonged solely to him. It belonged to the idea that the plantation could be known from within without being acknowledged. And ideas are harder to contain than structures. Whitaker's response, when it finally came, was not targeted at the tunnel. He did not know it existed. Instead, he attempted to restore certainty through increased oversight. Night patrols were extended. Record-keeping became more detailed. Overseers were instructed to account for time more precisely. These measures produced data, but not clarity. Because the problem was not lack of information. It was that information was no longer exclusive. Nathaniel observed these changes from below. He adjusted his movements, shortened his routes, reinforced weak points. The tunnel endured, but the environment around it grew more volatile. The plantation was reacting, not to a visible threat but to a loss of confidence in its own visibility. This was the moment when the tunnel's existence crossed a threshold. It was no longer merely a hidden structure. It had become a factor in the plantation's decision-making, even though no one could name it. And once that happened, its influence could no longer be confined to quiet observation. Something unseen was shaping behavior above ground. And systems built on certainty do not tolerate that for long. When what was hidden could no longer remain invisible. There is a point in every closed system when adjustment stops working. For years, Hawthorne Ridge had adapted without acknowledgement. Schedules tightened. Oversight increased. Rules multiplied. Yet none of these measures restored the certainty Whitaker believed he had lost. The plantation still functioned, but its responses were no longer predictable. Efficiency appeared in the wrong places. Failures clustered where authority felt strongest. The system obeyed, but it did not align. This was when intelligence, long buried, long unspoken, began to surface. Not as rebellion, not as defiance, but as pattern. The first unmistakable sign came during the spring planting season of 1832. A miscalculation, small but consequential, was made in seed distribution. The error should have resulted in uneven growth across 3 adjoining fields. Instead, the yields were remarkably balanced. When questioned, the overseers could not explain how the correction had occurred. No additional seed purchases were recorded. No instructions had been issued. Yet the outcome contradicted expectation. Whitaker dismissed it as coincidence. But coincidences, when repeated, begin to suggest design. That summer, repairs appeared where no damage had been reported. A bridge support reinforced before a collapse. A storage floor strengthened before rot set in. The plantation avoided losses it should not have anticipated. Each incident, isolated, was insignificant. Together, they suggested awareness that exceeded assigned roles. The intelligence shaping these outcomes did not announce itself. It did not seek recognition. It simply operated, quietly, efficiently, beneath the plantation's notice. And that was the problem. Nathaniel Reed understood systems because he had spent his life maintaining them. He knew that authority relies not just on force, but on the belief that it sees everything. The tunnel had already undermined that belief. Now, the knowledge gained from it was shaping outcomes in ways that could no longer be attributed to chance. The underground routes allowed Nathaniel to observe not only conversations but reactions. He learned how information moved, or failed to move, across the estate. Which messages were delayed. Which warnings were ignored. Which assumptions governed decisions made far from the fields. Over time, this understanding became operational. He did not issue instructions. He did not gather followers. Instead, he made adjustments, small changes in placement, timing, and emphasis, that redirected effort without appearing directive. A tool moved to a different location. A repair prioritized quietly. A warning shared indirectly, framed as observation rather than advice. These actions did not challenge authority. They simply outperformed it. And systems rarely forgive being outperformed by what they refuse to recognize. The shift became visible during an inspection by an outside assessor, a creditor evaluating the plantation's financial stability. Whitaker expected the visit to confirm his competence. Instead, it exposed inconsistencies he could not explain. Productivity metrics contradicted labor reports. Maintenance costs did not align with infrastructure age. Loss prevention exceeded industry norms. The assessor asked questions Whitaker could not answer. For the first time, uncertainty entered the record. That uncertainty traveled quickly. Rumors circulated, not among the enslaved population but among neighboring landowners. Hawthorne Ridge was described as oddly run, efficient but opaque, profitable but difficult to replicate. Success without visible cause unsettles those invested in hierarchy. Inside the plantation, the effect was quieter but deeper. People began making decisions based not on fear but on anticipation. Anticipation of what would be noticed, of what would be ignored, of where intervention would arrive late, or not at all. This shift did not reduce control outright. It changed the logic by which control operated. Silence became strategic. Nathaniel saw this emerging clearly. The tunnel had not only given him access, it had altered the plantation's internal calculus. People no longer assumed that authority was omnipresent. They assumed it was selective. And selectivity creates opportunity. This was when intelligence became unavoidable. Not because Nathaniel revealed himself, but because outcomes forced recognition. Whitaker ordered audits. He replaced overseers. He increased patrols. Yet each response lagged behind the behavior it sought to correct. Authority reacted. It no longer led. And reaction is admission. The breaking point came with a fire, small, contained, and extinguished quickly. It caused minimal damage. But the response was telling. The fire had been anticipated. Water was already positioned. Tools were ready. Workers arrived before alarms were raised. Someone had known. Whitaker demanded answers. None were sufficient. No one admitted foreknowledge. No records indicated warning. The event was explained away as preparedness. But preparedness implies planning. Planning implies intelligence. From that moment, the plantation could no longer pretend that its operations were fully visible. Something was functioning beneath the surface, not physically but structurally. Decisions were being shaped before they reached authority. Risk was being managed without permission. Nathaniel felt the weight of this shift acutely. The tunnel had done what tunnels do, connected spaces meant to remain separate. Knowledge flowed where it should not. Influence traveled without name or title. The system was no longer closed. And closed systems do not survive once opened. Whitaker's response was predictable. He sought visibility. More inspections. More reports. More presence. He believed that by illuminating every corner he could restore control. But visibility does not create understanding. It creates noise. The plantation became louder, but less coherent. Nathaniel withdrew further underground. The tunnel became narrower in use, more cautious. He understood now that what he had built was no longer merely a structure. It was evidence, unacknowledged but increasingly undeniable, that intelligence could exist outside authority. And once that truth enters a system, it cannot be removed. Because intelligence does not require permission to persist. It adapts. It waits. It surfaces when conditions demand it. By the end of 1832, Hawthorne Ridge was still standing, still productive, still controlled in appearance, but the balance had shifted. The plantation no longer shaped outcomes alone. It responded to them. Something unseen had altered the foundation. And in the next phase, that alteration would provoke a response the system could not moderate quietly. When visibility becomes a weapon, and power reveals its limits, authority rarely retreats quietly. When Whitaker recognized that Hawthorne Ridge no longer moved according to his intentions, he did not question the structure of his control. He questioned its reach. In his mind, the solution was not restraint but expansion. More presence, more scrutiny, more certainty imposed from above. He believed the plantation had grown opaque because it had not been watched closely enough. So he made it visible. The first changes were procedural. Daily tallies replaced weekly ones. Overseers were required to submit written reports rather than verbal summaries. Movement across the estate was reorganized into tighter windows of time, each task assigned a narrower boundary. What had once been managed through routine was now monitored through record. But records do not create obedience. They only document its absence. The second phase followed quickly. Patrols were increased, not to respond to incidents but to prevent them. Lanterns appeared along paths that had previously gone dark at night. Storerooms were locked earlier. Meetings, once informal and irregular, were scheduled and observed. The plantation became brighter, louder, more deliberate, and yet less effective. Because visibility has a cost. It consumes attention. And attention, when spread thin, creates blind spots. Nathaniel understood this immediately. The tunnel had taught him that systems built on oversight fail when oversight becomes excessive. When everything is watched, nothing is truly seen. The new measures disrupted routines without restoring confidence. Workers moved more cautiously but not more honestly. Overseers followed procedures but no longer trusted their instincts. Decisions slowed. Communication hardened into formality. The plantation functioned, but it strained. Whitaker mistook strain for resistance. And resistance in his world required correction. Force entered not as spectacle but as reinforcement. A reminder. Discipline was made visible, not to punish deviation but to deter imagination. Consequences were clarified. Lines were redrawn. Still, the intelligence shaping outcomes did not disappear. It adjusted. Nathaniel reduced his movements through the tunnel, not because it was unsafe, but because it was no longer necessary to move often. The influence he had cultivated now existed independently. Others understood timing. They understood placement. They understood how to respond without instruction. The system had internalized what it once resisted. Whitaker's greatest miscalculation was believing that force restores belief. It does not. It replaces belief with compliance, and compliance is brittle. The plantation began to fracture in subtle ways. Reports contradicted observations. Patrols overlapped inefficiently. Resources were consumed by monitoring rather than production. The appearance of control increased while its substance diminished. Outside observers noticed. Neighboring estates adopted Whitaker's methods selectively, then abandoned them. They saw what he did not. Hawthorne Ridge was no longer leading by strength, but reacting to loss. That realization unsettled Whitaker more than any rumor. He demanded explanations that could not be given. He replaced overseers who asked questions. He tightened structures that no longer responded. And still, outcomes diverged from intention. The breaking point was not violent. It was administrative. A scheduled inspection uncovered discrepancies too consistent to dismiss. Supplies appeared where none were logged. Repairs occurred without authorization. Preventive measures were taken before risks were identified. Someone was thinking ahead. And thinking ahead without authority was intolerable. Whitaker ordered a full review of the plantation's physical layout. Buildings were measured. Foundations inspected. Storage areas examined. The land itself became suspect. The tunnel, though never fully discovered, became inferred. Workers were questioned, not harshly but persistently. Silence met inquiry. Not defiance. Not confusion. Silence shaped by understanding. That silence was not empty. It was coordinated. And coordination is what power fears most. Whitaker escalated again. Night watches increased. Access points were restricted. The plantation became inward-facing, suspicious of its own rhythms. Trust eroded not only downward but laterally. Overseers watched each other. Reports were cross-checked obsessively. Control consumed itself. Nathaniel watched this unraveling with a clarity that surprised even him. The tunnel had given him knowledge, but knowledge alone does not dismantle systems. Overreach does. Authority, when stretched too far, reveals its seams. And those seams were now visible. The plantation could not return to what it had been. The attempt to dominate every variable had altered its character. What once relied on routine now depended on enforcement. What once assumed obedience now demanded proof. And proof, once required, is never sufficient. The most telling moment came when Whitaker canceled a long-standing harvest practice, not because it was inefficient, but because it could not be fully monitored. Productivity suffered. Morale declined. Yet he persisted. Visibility had become more important than outcome. That was the limit of his power. Nathaniel understood then that the tunnel had done more than undermine oversight. It had exposed a truth authority cannot tolerate. That control depends on what it chooses not to see. Once everything is forced into the light, the system collapses under its own weight. By late autumn, Hawthorne Ridge was quieter, not from obedience but from withdrawal. Initiative vanished. Decisions awaited instruction. Efficiency declined, not from resistance but from absence of belief. The plantation still stood, but it no longer governed effectively. Nathaniel did not celebrate this. He did not claim victory. He recognized it for what it was, an inflection point. The moment when force reveals its limits, and authority confronts the consequences of its own excess. What followed would not be swift, or dramatic, or easily contained, because systems do not collapse when challenged. They collapse when they lose the capacity to believe in themselves, when force could no longer restore belief. Force can compel action. It cannot compel meaning. By the winter following Whitaker's campaign of visibility, Hawthorne Ridge still functioned, but only in form. The plantation continued to record output, assign labor, enforce rules. On paper it remained intact. In practice something essential had receded. Belief. Belief that effort would be recognized. Belief that order served purpose. Belief that authority understood the system it governed. Once that belief was gone, force became maintenance rather than control, an effort to hold together something already loosening from within. Whitaker sensed the change but misread its cause. He believed the plantation was resisting him. In truth, it was disengaging. The first signs appeared in places that rarely drew attention. Tasks were completed correctly but without adjustment. Problems were reported exactly as observed, without suggestion or mitigation. Small efficiencies, once common, once unspoken, vanished. No one broke rules. No one challenged orders. No one intervened early. The plantation began to behave like a machine stripped of its intuition. Nathaniel Reed recognized this shift immediately. 4 years, intelligence had moved quietly through the system, compensating for blind spots, correcting errors before they became visible. That intelligence had never belonged to one person alone. It had been shared indirectly, embedded in habit and timing. Now it was withdrawing. Not out of fear, but calculation. Nathaniel understood that force had changed the cost of initiative. Where insight once improved outcomes, it now attracted scrutiny. Where foresight once protected the plantation, it now risked exposure. Intelligence, like any resource, adapts to incentives. And the incentive had become silence. This was the plantation's quiet unraveling, not through rebellion but through absence. Whitaker responded with escalation. More rules. More documentation. More enforcement. But each addition slowed the system further. Decisions bottlenecked. Approvals stacked. Responsibility narrowed until no one felt authorized to act beyond instruction. The plantation began to miss things it once caught instinctively. A drainage issue went unresolved until it damaged a field. A supply shortage reached crisis before being addressed. A minor injury became debilitating due to delayed response. None of this was sabotage. It was compliance without engagement. Whitaker punished the outcomes, not understanding their source. But punishment only confirmed the lesson already learned. Initiative was dangerous. Silence was safer. Even overseers, once the plantation's intermediaries, began to retreat into procedure. They followed directives exactly. They stopped improvising. They protected themselves by adhering strictly to instruction, even when those instructions were flawed. The system had become rigid. And rigidity is fragile. Outside pressures intensified this fragility. Market fluctuations, weather unpredictability, labor demands, factors that required adaptation, now collided with a structure incapable of flexible response. Hawthorne Ridge no longer absorbed shock. It transmitted it. Nathaniel observed all of this from below, metaphorically and literally. The tunnel was rarely used now. It had done its work. The intelligence it enabled had already reshaped behavior across the estate. What remained was consequence. The most telling change was emotional, not visible but pervasive. Fear had diminished. Not because conditions improved, but because expectation had narrowed. People no longer anticipated fairness, correction, or understanding. They anticipated only enforcement. And when expectation contracts, fear loses its power. Nothing is more destabilizing to authority than the absence of fear. Whitaker noticed this last. He interpreted it as defiance. He demanded demonstrations of loyalty, attendance, acknowledgement, response. He received compliance. But compliance is hollow. The plantation's decline was not dramatic. There were no uprisings, no mass refusal, no singular event to point to as failure. Instead, there was accumulation of inefficiency, of delay, of loss. Costs rose. Yields flattened. Reputation shifted. Hawthorne Ridge was no longer exceptional. It became cautious, conservative, overmanaged. Other landowners observed and adjusted, not by copying Whitaker but by avoiding his mistakes. The system he sought to perfect became a warning. Inside the plantation, the withdrawal deepened. Knowledge that once circulated quietly now remained localized. Problems were allowed to reach authority rather than being solved below it. Each escalation confirmed the belief that solutions were no longer welcome. Nathaniel did not orchestrate this. He did not direct it. He simply watched a system react to its own rigidity. He understood now that the tunnel's greatest impact was not secrecy, but proof. Proof that intelligence could exist beyond authorization. That authority did not monopolize understanding. Once that proof entered the system, it could not be erased by force. Whitaker attempted one final correction. He reorganized leadership, consolidating control under fewer overseers, increasing hierarchy. He believed this would restore clarity. It restored delay. Decisions slowed further. Communication distorted. Responsibility concentrated until it became unsustainable. The plantation did not collapse. It hollowed. Nathaniel saw this hollowing as both outcome and warning. Power, when overextended, does not shatter immediately. It thins. It loses density. It remains visible but ineffective. By the end of that year, Hawthorne Ridge was still governed, but no longer guided. Authority remained, but insight had withdrawn. And intelligence, once hidden, had learned a final lesson. Survival does not always require presence. Sometimes it requires endurance. What remained after force exhausted itself was not order, but memory. Memory of how things had once worked differently. Memory of what was possible without permission. That memory did not belong to one man. It belonged to the system now. And it would outlast the structures that tried to suppress it. What survived when authority lost its grip? Long after Whitaker's measures hardened into habit, Hawthorne Ridge continued to exist in name and boundary. Fields were still marked. Buildings still stood. Records still accumulated in ledgers that thickened with each season. From a distance, the plantation appeared unchanged, another southern estate persisting through routine and repetition. But systems are not defined by what remains visible. They are defined by what continues to function. By the time Whitaker recognized that his authority no longer guided outcomes, it had already lost the capacity to recover. He could command behavior, but he could not command belief. And belief, once withdrawn, does not return through enforcement. The greatest failure of Hawthorne Ridge was not that a tunnel had existed beneath it. Nor was it that intelligence had circulated beyond permission. Those were symptoms. The failure was more fundamental. The plantation had taught itself that authority was not synonymous with understanding. Once that lesson took hold, it could not be unlearned. Nathaniel Reed understood this before anyone else, not because he sought legacy but because he recognized pattern. The tunnel had been a response to constraint, not a rebellion against it. It had allowed intelligence to move where authority could not. When that movement altered outcomes, it exposed a truth the plantation could not reconcile, that its power depended on what it refused to acknowledge. Exposure did not destroy Hawthorne Ridge. Adaptation did. As the years passed, the rigid structures Whitaker imposed began to soften, not through reform but through erosion. New overseers inherited procedures they did not understand. They followed rules without knowing why they existed. Documentation increased while clarity diminished. Authority became performative. Those who worked the land adjusted accordingly. They complied precisely. They withheld nothing asked of them. But they offered nothing beyond instruction. Knowledge remained localized. Initiative stayed dormant. The system functioned at its narrowest capacity. This was not resistance. It was survival within constraint. The intelligence that once moved through the plantation did not vanish. It relocated. It learned discretion. It learned patience. It learned how to exist without drawing attention. What survived was not the tunnel itself. Over time, sections collapsed, entrances were obscured, and the earth reclaimed what had been carved beneath it. Physical evidence faded. But methods endured. People remembered how problems had once been anticipated rather than punished. They remembered that coordination did not require visibility. They remembered that silence could be structured. Those memories shaped behavior quietly, subtly, across years. Nathaniel lived long enough to see Whitaker replaced, not removed in disgrace but eased aside as effectiveness declined. The transition was administrative. Unremarkable. Authority shifted hands without ceremony. Nothing changed. The plantation continued to produce. It continued to enforce. It continued to exist within the broader system that sustained it. Yet it never regained what it had lost. Hawthorne Ridge became a place where decisions were slower than necessary, where risks were discovered late, where efficiency depended entirely on oversight rather than judgment. Its reputation shifted accordingly. Other estates surpassed it, not through innovation but through flexibility. They learned from its failure without naming it. The lesson traveled without attribution. That was the plantation's final irony. Its greatest influence occurred after it lost control. Nathaniel Reed was never credited. His name did not appear in records. His actions were not documented. The tunnel was not preserved as artifact or proof. History as written moved on. But systems remember what records forget. The survival of intelligence did not require recognition. It required continuity. The habits shaped by quiet coordination endured beyond Hawthorne Ridge, carried by those who left, by those who adapted, by those who learned when to act and when not to. Authority cannot suppress what it cannot see, and it cannot see what no longer needs to move openly. In the end, the plantation failed not because it was exposed, but because exposure revealed something it could not unmake, that control was contingent, that oversight had limits, and that intelligence does not belong exclusively to power. What survived was not defiance. It was understanding. Understanding that systems rely on trust they rarely acknowledge. Understanding that force replaces belief only temporarily. Understanding that silence, when chosen, can be strategic rather than submissive. Those understandings outlasted Whitaker. They outlasted Hawthorne Ridge's moment of prominence. They outlasted the tunnel itself. They persisted quietly, embedded in behavior, timing, restraint. And that persistence, more than any hidden structure beneath the soil, marked the plantation's greatest failure. Not that it lost control, but that it proved control had never been absolute to begin with.